Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be looking at 10 albums that really gave birth to the genre that we know as jazz rock, or later as it became known, jazz fusion. Jazz fusion or jazz rock, as it says, the idea is that we have a fusion between jazz and rock. So we have the immediacy and improvisational virtuosity of jazz, but combined with rock beats and also electric instruments, synthesizers, electric guitars. A groove which is more straighter pulsed rather than the swing of jazz. That is basically what we're talking about when we talk about jazz rock. The problem when we start to look at the beginnings of this genre is that rock music, all right, is actually develops from rock and roll. And rock and roll is basically a combination of jazz, rhythm and blues, country music. You know, if we look at soul, for example, soul is a mixture of rhythm and blues, gospel music and jazz. So jazz is intertwined into the birth of rock music. Okay, so it's actually quite hard to look where musicians are fusing jazz with rock, because the jazz is already in the rock. What we have to look at is when does rock begin as a genre, and then look at, once that genre has been created, who then marries jazz with that new genre. Okay, so rock music is really coming out of experiments that are going on with pop music, rock and roll in the early 60s on both sides of the Atlantic, but especially in London, where there's a sort of melting pot in London of musicians that are bringing in blues influences and jazz influences into sort of rock and roll. Okay, people like John Mayall Blues Breakers, Georgie Fame, Graham Bond, and then that's having ramifications in bands like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, who then, spurred on by people like Bob Dylan, are pushing the envelope creatively of what rock and roll can do. And we see this slow morphing from rock and roll to rock music. I would say rock music is really born around about 1966 with the advent of Cream. I would say that's a really good point to look at it. And then we have Hendrix coming a few months later. We've got Jeff Beck releasing stuff with the Yardbirds. So rock music as a genre, as opposed to rock and roll beat groups or whatever you want to call it. Let's look at it 65, 66. So we can't really have jazz rock fusion until after that point. Okay, so that's the first consideration I've taken into this. The second consideration is I'm not going to list In a Silent Way by Miles Davis. I'm not going to list Tony Williams' Lifetime. All that stuff is 1969. I'm looking at a window between around about 1965, 66 and 1968. All the albums I'm going to discuss are definite fusions between jazz and rock, but they're before 1969. So all those people who want to try and catch me out and put albums in the comments, make sure your albums are from 68 or before. We're looking at a window of about 2 or 3 years where we can really plot the birth of jazz rock. Okay? Right, now, the first album on my list of 10, and this isn't ranked, this is just 10 albums that I think we can really say are sort of definitive moments in the birthing of this genre. The first album is actually from 1964. Right, I know this album as Solid Bond, and that album is a collection of tunes by Graham Bond spanning somewhere between 63 and 66, 67. On there is some recordings with an incredible lineup, which is Graham Bond on alto sax, organ, Dick Hextall Smith on saxophone, Ginger Baker on drums, Jack Bruce on bass, basically with the exception of Cream, and John McLaughlin on guitar. And on that album, Solid Bond, is a couple of tracks recorded at Kluke's nightclub in 1964. And what we're really seeing on here is the birth of rock music. That's what we're hearing when we listen to those tracks. And the birth of rock music is the interjection of jazz into sort of a heavy electric guitar sound and a heavier beat, still swinging. They haven't started playing backbeats or straight note 16th beats. Now, this album, Solid Bond, has also appeared a number of times on CD. It's there was a CD, I don't think it's in print anymore, called Live at Kluke's Cleek, which is the nightclub where it was recorded, and it's also come out on a CD called The Beginnings of Jazz Rock. So I'm going to really stake not just the beginnings of jazz rock, but the beginnings of rock with this moment in 1964 with Graham Bond. I think this is very important stuff here. One of the things that's interesting is as soon as we start to talk about the history of jazz rock, we really see it properly defined in 1971 by the Mahavishnu Orchestra. John McLaughlin emerges as the great sort of visionary of jazz rock. And then anyone who checks out his biography sees he's appeared with Miles Davis on In a Silent Way, he's appeared on A Bitch's Brew, then he's appeared on Jack Johnson, and people start to go, oh my God, he's doing a jazz rock thing here with Miles. Miles is a pioneer of jazz rock, which he is, and he's going to be on my list, don't worry. But actually, McLaughlin is right there back in 64, pursuing a fusion of all these things right at the start. And doesn't that make him an interesting character when he then moves from this, melting pot scene in London over to New York and forms Tony Williams' Lifetime in 69 and then appears on In a Silent Way the same year. It's really interesting. So that's my first album, is Live at Kluke's Cleek or Solid Bond or The Beginnings of Jazz Rock, whatever title you want to look at it, by the Graham Bond Band from 1964. Another album pre-66 I'm going to throw into the mix, which I don't think is a fusion album or jazz rock album, but I think it's a very important album to mention at this point. And that's John Handy at the Monterey Jazz Festival. This album was very, very successful in 1965. It comes out, it's got two very long-form, free-form tracks on there. The soloing is what I would call post-Coltrane soloing. It's not necessarily swinging. The first track on there is swinging, but it's a slow loping swing. It's almost got like a backbeat. And at one point, the drummer's playing straight time. The second track is in 6/8, which is going to become a staple for jazz fusion. So the timings are pushed. But what's most important about this album is the way that they're improvising and the instrumentation. So on the album, we have John Handy on alto saxophone. We've got the incredible Michael White on violin. Now, Michael White is a sort of the closest we get to a post-Coltrane free violinist. And he's going to crop up a couple of times here. And so I'm going to give a shout out for Mike White as being a very important pioneer in terms of jazz rock. Later in the 70s, he brought out some sort of very spiritual Afro jazz, soul jazz albums, which, although aren't jazz rock, are very important in the history as well. So Michael White, I think this is a heavyweight. And when we think how important the violin is going to be in jazz rock because of its inclusion in the Mahavishnu Orchestra, you automatically put the credit there. But here we have in 65, John Handy making a very free album with a violin and also Jerry Hann on electric guitar. And it's the inclusion of these instruments on this and the free blowing way. And go and listen to it and you will hear that this is almost like a blueprint of how musicians are going to be able to improvise in a rock context. They're not going to be playing bebop through changes. They're going to be playing a much more free-form modal approach, locking into these straighter times and different rhythms and utilising, the violin, which is pointing towards indie music, and the electric guitar. Jerry Hann on guitar is going to crop up later in the Gary Burton band, and that's going to be a very important band there on my list. And Jerry Hann is another guitarist that we need to give a shout out, an early pioneer of jazz rock fusion. There's a whole bunch of people here that do not get the credit, but these are the ones that are here first. That album also features Don Thompson on bass and Terry Clark drums. I wish I carried all this information around in my head. I don't. I'm having to refer to a few notes here. So that's from 65. That's my second album. Right, my third album I want to discuss is Out of Sight and Sound by the Free Spirits. This is recorded in incredible early 1966. It's released in 67. But what we have here is a jazz group called the Free Spirits that have teamed up with Larry Coryell. And Larry Coryell, who is a full-on jazz guitarist, who's been playing with Chico Hamilton. He's schooled in jazz. He's bringing in rock influences, rock beats, psychedelia, electric guitar, and vocals. And this is happening in 1966. I think this is really is a point where we can say, God, this is really where fusion is starting to emerge. That band also featured the unlikely named Columbus Chip Baker on rhythm guitar and backing vocals, who I think was not a jazz musician, he was a full-out rock musician. And that's quite an interesting thing, because we're going to see that later on some classic fusion albums. I'm thinking Jerry Goodman, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, I'm thinking of Tommy Bolin on Spectrum, but there we have it right back in 66, 67. We got the legendary Jim Pepper on alto sax, full-on jazz musician, Chris Hills on bass, and Bob Moses. Bob Moses is such an incredible drummer that has played such a huge part in the development of this genre. Here he is right at the start of it, you know, and he's going to go on to play with Gary Burton, he's going to play with Pat Metheny, he's going to be on so many important albums. But when people say go to, you know, jazz fusion drummers, jazz rock drummers, me included, don't think Bob Moses. So it's brilliant to be able to shout out these guys. So here we are, 66, 67. People are now exploring how to mix jazz and rock. Now, if you actually sit down and listen to Out of Sight and Sound by the Free Spirits, what it sounds is a very sort of, you know, almost quite cheesy psychedelic rock band that's got maybe a few more extended solos than the average rock band at that time. These are not, for me, successful fusions. They're definitely fusions, and they're groundbreaking, and there's some incredibly interesting things going on. But all the stuff I've listed at the moment, I don't think I see a definitive point where we see this is where we see jazz fusion birth. This is it, fully formed and artistically successful, creatively successful, something that has achieved something, not just experimented it in somehow, sometimes at that point done well and not so well here, that these are masterpieces. Now, the next two albums I'm about to mention are masterpieces, and they are jazz rock albums. So I think these are the two albums that I'm going to shout out as being the birth of jazz rock or jazz fusion. The first is the incredible, this is a monumental album, a masterpiece album. It's the incredible Electric Bath by Don Ellis, the Don Ellis Orchestra. So Don Ellis was a trumpet player. He emerges in the late 50s. He's come out of the sort of Stan Kenton third stream, you know, progressive jazz. If jazz has got its progressive rock, it was this third stream sort of Kenton big band, bombastic, you know, movement that was very successful in the late 40s. Bands came out of that like Maynard Ferguson, and Don Ellis is, you know, comes to light as a musician playing with Maynard Ferguson in the 50s, early 60s. He gets interested in a lot of free jazz, avant-garde jazz, experimentation, you know, through Charlie Mingus, Coltrane, and he forms a big band in the early 60s to explore these areas. He's interested in electronics, he's interested in modality, he's interested in microtones, and that interest in microtone is coming from an interest in Indian music. In 1967, he creates an album called Electric Bath, and the extra thing he throws into the mix is rock music, odd time signatures. So here we have an album. This album is mind-blowing. It's one of the great jazz albums. I feel like Don Ellis has got forgotten in the mix, right? The drummer on Electric Bath is a drummer called Steve Bohannon. I hope I pronounced that right. And Steve Bohannon is having to negotiate Don Ellis's incredibly complex and tricky charts, which are jumping through so many different genres. He's having to play sort of modal Indian influence improvisation, but also play within a big band, hold that band together, and also negotiate Don Ellis's time signatures. We're not talking about a bit of 5/4 like Take 5. We're talking about some heavy time signatures. And Don Ellis is dividing those time signatures up in a way that comes from Indian music, using additive rather than divisive approach to rhythm. So rather than taking a time signature and breaking it down into crotchets, they're building it up from small clusters of 2s, 3s. You know, this is what I call additive rhythm. Steve Bohannon is the pioneer of this. On the follow-up album to this from '68, which is also an absolute masterpiece, we have a very young drummer, 19 years old I think at that point, called Ralph Humphrey, that of course we're going to see re-emerge later on in the 70s in the Frank Zappa band, taking that knowledge from Don Ellis and put it into the Zappa band, and this I feel is such an important moment. I'm very proud of the fact that Ralph Humphrey is a fan of the channel. If you have a look around, you'll see the odd comment from him. And I've been chatting with Ralph about the importance of this group. And hopefully at some point we're going to be able to get an interview with Ralph and really go into this. Because I think that Electric Bath, this is the album where I would say, you want to know the definitive masterpiece? It's not In a Silent Way. It's not Bitches Brew. It's not Emergency by Tony Williams' Lifetime. Important as those albums as are and landmarks in jazz history, but we can say here, 67 Electric Bath, we have all the elements. You look at the Mavish Orchestra, odd cycle signatures, heavy rock playing, the influence of Indian music, the additive structures, the use of electronics. It's all here 4 years before on Electric Bath. Now, one guy that I think is listening to Don Ellis quite closely is Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa's emerged in 1966 with Freak Out. Freak Out is pushing the envelope. It's turning rock music into an art form. It's laying the groundwork for progressive rock, but he's also got improvisation in there. Heavy improvisation coming from free jazz musicians. He's quoting Eric Dolphy, Albert Ayler. And I think there's a crossover because a lot of the musicians appear on Zappa albums that have also worked with Don Ellis. There seems to be a crossover, and I really feel that some of the exploration Don Ellis some of the areas Don Ellis is exploring is influencing Zappa. I've got no backup for that, but I think that is something I'd love to check out to see if that's the case. In 1967, Zappa brings out a double album called Uncle Meat, which is just full of long form jazz rock improvisation, pushing synthesis, electronics, the electric guitar, pushing everything to the limit, right? Uncle Meat, 1967, an absolute monumental album for jazz rock, another album that doesn't get mentioned. And in the same year, in 1967, Gary Burton brings out Duster. Burton's a child prodigy. He's emerged in the early 60s. He's a virtuoso vibraphone player. He's really pioneered the use of two mallets. He's playing chords and clusters and really sort of post-Coltrane approach to the vibraphone. But he's a young guy, and as much as he's a fan of Lionel Hampton and the Modern Jazz Quartet, he's also a fan of the Beatles. And he noticed the Beatles are constructing their songs in different ways. Sometimes they're using, say on the track like Tomorrow Never Knows, sort of looping modal structures. Sometimes they're using chord progressions that are interesting, but are not using the harmonic language of the 2-5-1. And he finds that very interesting. On bass, he has Steve Swallow, and Steve Swallow is an incredible bassist, but also an incredible composer. And he's also exploring this approach to chord progressions, approach to rock. And I think Gary Burton's one of the first musicians to create a fusion between jazz and rock, which has the sophistication required to promote advanced jazz improvisation. And the album where he really does this most successfully and for the first time is on Duster in 1967, which also features Larry Coryell on guitar, as I said, Steve Swallow on bass, and Roy Haynes on drums. You know, the great drummer that's been at so many points, right going back to Charlie Parker, so many points in jazz history. Here we have Larry Coryell turning up again. Larry Coryell is key. Larry Coryell is another pioneer. It's a guy that we have to point to and say, there's one of the pioneers of jazz rock. Right, so I'm now going to move on to 1968. And we've got a number of albums that I'm just going to run through pretty quick. The defining album for me in 68 is Miles in the Sky. Now, why this album doesn't get mentioned and In a Silent Way does the following year, I do not know. I've always had a little bit of an issue with it, In a Silent Way. Some people absolutely love it. I think People love it because it's a bit of an anomaly in Miles's catalogue. He's exploring stuff which is much more to do with space, ambience. Before this, Tony Williams has been this explosive polyrhythmical drummer. At this point, Tony wants to go. He's going to perform Tony Williams' Lifetime. And when I listen to it in a silent way, I can't help but feeling that Tony's a little bit switched off on that album. There's 1 minute where he kicks in, we hear a rock beat, but there's that only time. But if we listen to the album before Feed the Kilimanjaro, and then especially Miles in the Sky, which is from 1968, Miles in the Sky is where Miles turns to rock music, and the fusion that Miles comes up with is entirely successful. Miles in the Sky features the classic quintet. It's the last album to feature the classic quintet, so it's Miles on trumpet and cornet, Wayne Shorter on tenor saxophone, Herbie Hancock on piano, and electric piano on the track Stuff, so we suddenly hear electric instruments on here. Ron Carter on acoustic bass and electric bass on Stuff. Stuff is the track where Miles successfully takes on jazz rock. This is the moment. Not In a Silent Way, not Bitches Brew, not Jack Johnson. These are fully fledged jazz rock tracks. And on the track Paraphernalia, we also, along with the Tony Williams, we get George Benson on electric guitar. Benson's going to be a very important musician in the history of fusion in the 70s, albeit very middle of the road. But Benson is a heavyweight guitar player, as we know. So it's lovely to have him here on this album. So I'm promoting Miles in the Sky as being the album. Not In a Silent Way, not Bitches Brew, not Jack Johnson. 1968, Miles in the Sky. But what else is going on in 1968? We have the New Zealand keyboardist Mike Nock forms a band called The Fourth Way. Of course, The Fourth Way is named after the approach to enlightenment created by the great G.I. Gurdjieff. And anyone who's watched this channel will know there's always esoteric references to Gurdjieff on this channel. Here's another one, The Fourth Way by Mike Nock. That album also features the great Eddie Marshall on drums, fantastic jazz drummer, and again Michael White on violin. I have the first album, this album by the Fourth Way. This is, unlike the Free Spirits, burning, exciting, exploratory jazz rock. This is a key album. Mike Nock is a very important musician in the history of jazz rock. All right, we also have the great Jeremy Steig, the jazz flute player. He forms a band called Jeremy and the Satires, and he releases an album called Jeremy and the Satires in 1968, which also featured Adrian Goodery on guitar and harmonica, Warren B. Bernhardt on electric piano, the great Eddie Gomez on bass, and Donald McDonald, if you can believe that, on drums. This album, again, is interesting, and in that we are seeing a full-on fusion, but when I listen to it, it's very much twee sort of psychedelic rock jams with some heavy jazz playing, especially from Jeremy Steig, and Jeremy Steig's overblowing and doing all that sort of Roland Kirk approach to the flute, which is very interesting. But I think in terms of the actual fusion, it's not quite at the same level as Fourth Way. The reason why I put it on is that there is in 68 with a band that is really exploring this. I feel that later on in 1970s on there's an album called Energy by Jeremy Steig, which has got Jan Hammer on keyboards. Is it Don Elias on drums? I'm not sure. That album is just a heavyweight album in terms of jazz rock fusion, and there they're really blowing. You can hear elements of this here. Jeremy Steig's a very important musician in the history of jazz rock. Of course, in the mainstream, he's known as doing the flute for the Pied Piper in Shrek 3, which I always thought was very interesting. The sample of the Beastie Boys flute loop, is it? There's quite a few Beastie Boys songs with samples from Jeremy Steig. So it's interesting to see this early jazz rock fusion having such a mainstream cultural influence. I always find that really interesting that Jeremy Steig appears as the Pied Piper in Shrek 3. I mean, the Pied Piper looks like Jeremy Steed, but of course this is because his dad is the guy that invented Shrek. Facts. You get some facts every now and then from me. Right. I've come to the last album, the 10th album that I want to discuss. This album, again, not entirely artistically successful, but there's one track on there that's absolutely mind-blowing. It's the album Tomorrow Never Knows by Steve Marcus. Some of you might know Steve Marcus as the saxophone player in the Buddy Rich band later on. Buddy Rich does some incredible fusion albums in the 70s, Draw 74, A Different Drummer, two of my favourite fusion albums. And with the Buddy Rich band, with Don Ellis, if we now throw into the mix Chicago, Blood, Sweat and Tears, and also Chase, right? Dreams, Cobham's band, there's a whole video yet to be done on this sort of brass heavy jazz rock, which sort of emerges a little bit before proper jazz rock. So Tomorrow Never Knows by Steve Marcus. Great album. Not every track is successful, but they are really trying to explore a fusion of jazz and rock. It's interesting because they're using rock beats, electric guitar, they use a lot of sort of free improvisation, and they're pushing the limits of what you can do. Because you've got to understand, when you, as soon as you try and fuse jazz and rock, you've got quite a simplified form that doesn't necessarily promote high improvisation. A lot of the musicians here that we're discussing, that's what they're trying to negotiate. Gary Burton's done it in one way by really restructuring the harmony, the chord changes. Miles is doing it in one way by using sort of Miles's pressure cooker improvisation approach to jazz, just to get incredible musicians to sort of morph new forms. Don Ellis is doing it through the use of Indian music and odd time signatures, a thing that's going to be groundbreaking in the Mavish Noksha. If you listen to the title track by Tomorrow Never Knows, the title track, which of course is them jamming over that loping, loopy, psychedelic, track by the Beatles, as I mentioned before, that opens a door. When the Beatles made Tomorrow Never Knows, with all that sort of music concrete flying over the top, a jazz musician would listen to that and go, oh God, I've got space to work in there. And my God, does Steve Marcus work in there. It's mind-blowing saxophone playing, mind-blowing. So those are my 10 albums that really give birth to this genre we love, jazz rock. I'm going to mention a few others very quickly. Special mention must go to soul jazz. I've tried to keep it out of this mix, but Herbie Hancock, Cantaloupe Island, that's from 62, 63. Is that a jazz rock out? I'm thinking Eddie Harris, Les Bacan compared to what? Jazz rock. I'm thinking some of the soul jazz stuff that Cannibal Adderley did. All that soul jazz stuff is very important in the mix. I think some of the stuff that Chico Hamilton did as well in the mid-60s with Gabor Szabo on guitar and also Larry Coryell, very important. You see, when you get into Latin jazz, soul jazz, you see people starting to straighten the beat out. There was a big thing at the time when critics said it wasn't possible to do high improvisation over a straight eighth note pulse, that you had to have a swing there. That was like essential for jazz. That's up to nonsense. Great jazz musicians could improvise over anything, and I think at the time musicians like Ornette Coleman are creating an argument for this. Anyway, so I think there's other stuff that I haven't put in the mix. Also, there is all the stuff that's going on in rock music at the time, and I haven't brought that in either. Cream's improvisation, especially live. Hendrix with tracks like Voodoo Child, Machine Gun. I'm thinking of the Byrds, with their explorations into sort of Coltrane territory. So there's a whole host of stuff, and as I'm sitting there, I'm zoning off thinking, have you forgotten, this and you've forgotten that. But what I've tried to do is cover where jazz musicians and rock musicians are coming together and creating definite long-form improvised jazz rock. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sure it's going to promote a bit of discussion. If you like this, you know, if you like, these videos are hard. You know, I'm really exploring areas when I discuss this, and I'm not too sure about myself. I don't think anyone's done a definitive analysis of jazz rock. I think Stuart Nicholson's book is pretty good, and that's influenced me a lot in doing this. But a lot of this that I'm coming through here is really from my own experience of doing this channel, and people mention so much stuff when I check it out, and it's really shifted my opinion on this. So I am myself learning about this and exploring into this. There is a video I did a few years back called the Origins of Jazz Rock or Jazz Fusion. That would be an interesting thing to compare to what I've said today. I'm going to finish by picking one album out of these 10, the definitive album that I think birthed jazz rock. If I had to just pick one and point to that, the album that comes before Tony Williams' Lifetime, that becomes before In a Silent Way, comes before Bitches Brew, Jack Johnson, all those albums that often get mentioned as being the, you know, forerunners of jazz rock. And that album will be Electric Bath by Don Ellis. There's a lot of great albums on this list. The masterpiece for me would be Electric Bath and Miles in the Sky, and let's just have another look, and Uncle Meat. They're the three masterpieces. Duster by Gary Burton, very good. But the three masterpieces on this list. So if you just want to go to get three albums to cover this early period: Mars in the Sky, Electric Bath, Uncle Meat. Right. If you want to go deeper into this and get into heavier discussions, then please become a Patreon. There's so much going on there now. I'm loving my Patreon. I'm able to get into all sorts of different areas on there. So if you want to do that, then become a patron. The link's down there. Come and have a look. You know, you can see all the stuff that you can't see. And if it looks fun, then come and join for a month and see how you get on. Anyway, I'm going to go now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video. Bye.